Luk Lang was a deity that had existed since the beginning, and one day, she decided to create the heavens full of life and plants, and the earth, which was merely a barren desert. Upset with the emptiness of earth, Luk Lang brought down plants and life from the heavens to populate their now beautiful creation. For a long period of time, most low-lying islands that make up Micronesia had not yet formed, or were uninhabitable due to the volatile sea levels of the Pacific at the time. There are higher, volcanic islands that may have provided homes for Polynesian explorers earlier than archaeology has shown, and there are certain indications pointing to this, but it isn't certain. Remaining to what is more confidently known, the nature of human migration in this part of Oceania at the time was that women would mostly stay put, while men left to find other communities to marry into. This paired with currents between Palau and the islands of Yap that are very regular. It is no surprise that the people in Palau found and settled these western Micronesian islands of Yap. These Palauans arrived with an already developed material culture, and immediately set to work clearing trees to make room for agricultural land, as the islands don't have the abundance to provide for hunter-gatherer lifestyles. As the Polynesians continued to settle on Yap, building villages, they began a distinct material culture from that of Palau, while probably maintaining contact through trade. Yap was more likely close to the eastern limit of these people's colonization into Micronesia, as travel was much more difficult with few islands to hop between, meaning that after a couple hundred years of human settlement in western Micronesia, the eastern islands were finally settled by a completely separate group of people. Melanesians most likely sailed northwards to settle Micronesia, but how they did so is a mystery. Most commonly, it is theorized that they brought foodstuffs with them from their homes, and these plants and animals would be left to spread freely on the island so that, eventually, they could come back and live off the land. This might suggest that humans knew of these high islands long before they were settled. When the Melanesians colonized the land, they preferred to build stilt houses on the reefs of the islands, creating artificial extensions to the land and leaving the island itself relatively untouched. Archaeological evidence shows that the main eastern islands of Koshrai, Pohnpei, and Chuuk were all settled around the same period of time, but due to technological restraints, in which order, we don't know. Meanwhile, the various atolls that make up modern-day Micronesia began to form, allowing the Melanesians to further expand their settlements through the Pacific Ocean, making their way westwards. This westward expansion was sluggish in the beginning, as these Melanesians did not have a tradition of colonizing atolls, but slowly, they learned how to thrive under the different conditions by learning where to find fresh water and cultivating taro. Once they reached far enough west, atoll dwellers began relations with Yap for resources not available to them on the smaller islands. All the while, the Yapese formed a strict caste system, with lower ranks owing a tribute of labor and gifts to the landowners, and diverted from their Palauan roots through becoming comparatively land-based. Their more terrestrial lifestyle was only possible as atoll dwellers were reliant on high islanders for many of the goods unattainable on atolls, so the wealth of trade came to the Yapese, rather than the opposite. This pattern of atoll reliance on high islands repeated throughout Micronesia, and it secluded the populations of the high islands, which allowed for most of them to develop a surprisingly distinct culture and language. On the other hand, because atoll dwellers were reliant on others to fulfill their needs and escape from markedly common natural disasters, outside high islands, Micronesia became a deeply connected network of trade and travel. And the separation and independence of each island, atoll, and village due to geography meant that each worked in their own interest, and no overarching government was formed to unite the people of Micronesia. The importance of resources for atolls, and the power they gave those on high islands, meant that a complex system of constantly shifting trade, alliances, and enemies ensued between individual atolls and individual villages on high islands. Despite the political and physical division, Micronesia can be split into a few regions, by which high islands affected the surrounding atolls most, culturally, linguistically, religiously, and materially. This interwoven system remained the norm for centuries, but as there needs to be further research in the region, and the environment doesn't support natural preservation of artifacts, little is known about the ensuing period. We do see that for an extended period of time, Chuuk loses any indication of human life in the lagoon. Although unclear why, it may have been abandonment due to a natural disaster, an adoption of less stationary lifestyles to rely on subsistence, or progressively losing land to the sea hiding such evidence. During this so-called long gap on Chuuk, extremely important developments occurred in the east, as the first highly centralized system arose in Nan Madol, the most important population center of Pohnpei. The Sadalur dynasty was the rulers of this new governing system, and while initially good leaders, they became extremely authoritarian and ambivalent to the common folk. Under this dynasty, for the first time ever, Pohnpei was united under one power, with Nan Madol as its governing center. This is not to say that Pohnpei was stable afterwards, as they were subject to raids by atolls, and the Sadalur had to maintain power over those who contested their supremacy on the island. Another major development was that two types of breadfruit were selectively bred, and this new species made its way to Micronesia. Crossbreeding the breadfruit fundamentally changed Micronesian society, as it's resilient and grows fantastically on atolls, allowing for them to support larger populations. When harvested in large quantities, it could be fermented and stored long-term for later use in times of need. And most importantly, it took substantially less labor to harvest than other available food sources, which freed up significant manpower to be used elsewhere. Freeing up of manpower allowed the islanders to develop their material culture and focus increasingly on infrastructural projects, and the Sadalur dynasty took advantage of this. Massive basalt columns were transported from distant quarries to build megalithic structures, and some speculate that Nan Madol was developed with the intention of the impressive project attracting many traders and visitors to become a Pacific hub. Here knowledge could spread, goods traded, and notably due to the culture around trade that the islanders conducted, gifts would be brought to Nan Madol, all without having to take the journey to sea. While many call this site the Venice of the Pacific due to the canals between buildings, studies done on sea levels show that at the time of its construction, Nan Madol was probably above water. In the meantime, human evidence reappeared on Chuk, and we see that they were now relying increasingly on breadfruit, and with the ensuing population growth, Chukese people began increasingly warring against one another. Settlements were now built inland and on high ground, but surprisingly, the society of the Chuk Lagoon remained minimally hierarchical, despite the widespread warfare, as the divided geography of the islands allowed for each individual village to shift alliances and enemies as they saw fit. The megaliths on Nan Madol must have proven effective in reaching its goals, as another, similar site known as Lela was constructed soon after on Koshrai. Just as in Pohnpei, this occurred because of a feudal-like ruler uniting the island, which concentrated power and wealth in Lela, while making warfare much less frequent and stabilizing Koshrai. Yap was not able to fully benefit from the breadfruit, as their soil quality and climate varied compared to the east, and so taro and yam remained the staple crops here, but still, they remained an eminent power in the region. They did so through a system of annual tribute that most atolls between Yap and Chuk were a part of, known as Sawe. The sphere of influence possible through trade became known as the Yap Empire, although no real control was exerted over the atolls. Also, Yap was never one unified body, but a group of confederacies, so the title of empire does not really fit the relationship between Yap and surrounding atolls. East of Yap, Chuk was the only nearby high island that could have contested this system, but through their constant internal warfare and lack of a central place from where their power could emanate, they enabled Yapi's power. As a result of the Sawe, several villages on the east of Yap, such as Gachpar, Wainan, and Rican, became prominent centers of power and wealth. Soon a storm would rock the Moluccas, and a Portuguese explorer, Diogo de la Rocha, was blown off course and arrived in Ulithi. Having never encountered Europeans before, the Micronesians approached cautiously but without malice. Once some form of communication was established, the encounter was peaceful. Due to the season not allowing the Portuguese to return home, they were forced to stay with the Ulithians, who graciously allowed them to remain for several months until they were able to sail for Portuguese colonies in Indonesia. The Europeans decided to name the lands Isles of Sequeira, after Gomes de Sequeira, the navigator aboard the Portuguese vessel. Despite the extensive stay of these sailors, in the grand scheme of Micronesian history, this changed very little, since the perceived value of the atoll seemed insignificant compared to other colonial endeavors. But the Spanish and Portuguese colonial rivalry in the region meant that their European ships became increasingly common in the Pacific. As the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa was a notoriously dangerous route, Alvaro de Saavedra Cerón wanted to return to Spain with spices from their colony at Tidore by way of Panama. Unfavorable winds forced the Spaniards northwards, where they saw the Nimoy Islands, and attempted to take refuge here, but for an unknown reason, Saavedra found that the Micronesians were quite inhospitable and forced them to retreat. This voyage ultimately failed, and when a second attempt was conducted, the expedition was the first to see Pohnpei, although they did not stop here. Several other voyages would sail through Micronesia, namely that of Rui Lopez de Villalobos, naming several islands, but there were no attempts at colonization despite now being claimed by the Spanish crown. As they were lacking in exploitable resources, and on certain islands native people were aggressive towards Europeans, generally sailors avoided the islands. This can be seen as the official route that the Spanish took from their Philippine colonies circumvented Micronesia from the north. a tradition of atoll dwellers moving to high islands for resources, and when their homes were destroyed in war or disaster, was the norm in Micronesia. But on Pompeii, this system would prove detrimental to the Sadalur dynasty. Isokelekel was the leader of a group that were allowed to settle on Pompeii, but whether that is the name of the individual or the title that they were called by is unknown. In any case, later the Sadalur lord at the time and Isokalel butted heads, and Isokalel, who had become very influential since their settlement on Pompeii, used their power to unite several other nobles and atolls against the overlord of Pompeii. As mentioned before, the Sadalur kings were known to be often cruel and malevolent, so gaining this support was fairly easy, and this coalition of Micronesians began to revolt against their ruler. The popular uprising was able to overcome the long-lasting house, and Isokalel became the new power on Pompeii, taking the ruling seat at Nanmadol. We are not sure if this happened immediately after the death of Isokalel that revolted, but one of the following rulers of Pompeii abandoned Nanmadol in favor of ruling from the region, letting the megalithic site decay. In the west, Spain had a growing grip over the Philippines, and sometimes, unfortunate Micronesian sailors or castaways would be blown off course and land in their colony. When in the Spanish Philippines, sailors would recount stories of their homes and histories, in turn familiarizing the Micronesians with the Spanish and their language. All of this further connecting the two parties by the time some of the Micronesian stories were published and gained popularity throughout Europe. And the allure of islands populated like an anthill inspired the Spanish king to fund some expeditions. However, there were many shortcomings. For example, the islanders didn't specify where to find the islands they spoke of, and the funding for such explorations was still fairly limited. During this period of excitement, a Spanish explorer, Francisco Lazcano, named the islands Islas Carolinas, after the king, Charles II, and this name seemed to stick. After many expeditions, Palau was found, but to the dismay of the explorers, relations couldn't be established with its islanders, and as such, the Spanish crown lost much of its motivation for the search. In one last attempt before the efforts would be abandoned, Don Bernardo de Egui, coming from Guam, saw the Ulithi atoll, naming them the Garbanzo Islands, and stopping for a short time. The Ulithians approached the boat to trade, and asked for a hostage while they traded for safety, to which Iggy complied. Hoping to be able to use the Micronesians as guides through the waters, he offered them gifts of wine and iron in return for someone to join them, but no viable candidate stepped up. A rash decision was made to try and kidnap one of the native people. In the scuffle that followed, no one was captured, and it's unclear whether the hostage held by the Ulithians was killed in return. But after fumbling these relations, Iggy was off. Eventually, sailors from Welii would become lost and arrive at Guam, where they gave one of the best descriptions of Micronesia as of yet, which resulted in a surprisingly accurate map being drawn of the region. Friar Juan Cantova in particular found interest in the lives and culture of the Micronesians, and hoped to evangelize them to the Jesuit faith. He gathered an expedition and arrived in Ulithi, and while Cantova was much more sympathetic to the native people than most Europeans, fundamentally he believed the superiority of his faith and culture. This caused severe contentions between the two, as the missionary failed to take into account the relationship religion had with the islanders through daily norms, history, and not to mention the societal structure within the wider expanse of the Sawe system. Hierarchy was pivotal to the Sawe, as a chain of command helped maintain the flow of tribute within such a divided region. Some islands would receive tributes from others, who in turn might have their own subordinate islands. Lesser islands would send tribute to their seniors, which would happen all the way up the pecking order, finally reaching Yap at the head. Power was maintained through cultural hegemony and religious centers, so when Cantova decided to base his religious mission on Falalop, this was a direct challenge to the power that Mog Mog had over Ulithi. It is no surprise then that the mission, while able to convert some, was a resounding failure, resulting in the islanders killing Cantova. Europeans now fully abandoned their colonial and religious aims in Micronesia, and due to the historic longevity and strength of native systems and institutions, the Micronesians remained relatively unaffected. The complex relationships maintained between islands and the frequency of disasters honed Micronesian skills in diplomacy and adaptability, which helped retain their traditions as the world around them experienced drastic changes. Through their connections to other Polynesian communities, the Micronesians continued to hear of the repressive and violent hold colonial governments had, which, in absence of the Europeans, strengthened native resolve against them. These factors, paired with the lack of a historical record in the region, means that for a time, Micronesia fell into a period of obscurity. What we do know is that certain European goods, especially iron, became extremely valuable commodities. Even during the mission of Friar Cantova, One Ulithian is quoted in saying, "As you Christians long for heaven, so we islanders long for iron." This desire became so strong that men from Lamatrek sailed northwards to Guam to trade with the Europeans there, under the command of a Micronesian navigator, Luito. Historically, Guam and the Mariana Islands were part of the Micronesian trade system before the Spanish brutally took over, and this journey was no longer considered safe. The encounter proved to be a highly successful one, with the Lamatrek sailors being welcomed warmly and receiving many valuable goods, opening the door to sustained trade and contact in the future. However, the next year, on their second voyage, Luito and his crew became lost at sea, and at home, the islanders assumed the worst. With stories of Spanish deception and brutality common, this potential trade was abandoned. Luis de Torres, the vice-governor of Guam, wanted this trade, and sent an expedition south to find out why the Micronesians no longer came to Guam. Torres went to many islands and explained to the Carolinians that he did not harm Luito. Fortunately, the islanders believed him, and beginning the next year, ships representing various islands would make the annual trade voyage to Guam. This was the first direct and sustained trade that the Micronesians had established with Europeans, and Guam became hugely important to the islanders as a source of rare and valuable goods, available to this extent to them nowhere else. For the first time in a while, the trade relationship within Micronesia saw major shifts, as firstly, those islands that became distributing centers for European goods in the region, like Weliai and Lamatrek, grew very quickly in prominence and influence. Secondly, one of the most sought-after services the Carolinians could give in return for the European goods was navigational guidance, with the populations of the Marianas having lost their seafaring skills. Native Tamoru people lost the ability under colonial rule, and the colonizers themselves relied on goods being brought to them. So, as Micronesian sailors aided the Europeans, they found that the northern Mariana Islands were sparsely populated and experienced fewer natural disasters, while being closer to European trade. Many islanders wanted to resettle specifically on Saipan, and received the go-ahead by the colonial government if they embraced Christianity. Over the next few years, hundreds would establish a settlement called Arabual. Several factors now reignited European excitement for Pacific exploration, such as James Cook's voyage, which drastically changed European understanding of the Pacific. The waters were almost untouched by whalers, presenting new opportunities, and the Napoleonic Wars drastically changed the balance of powers in Europe and colonial borders. In this new motivation for exploration, Koshrai is finally located and interacted with, first by the French, followed by a Russian explorer, Fyodor Petrovich Lyitke, who stayed for several weeks. The Koshraians met both expeditions warmly, and the foreigners were left in awe of Lela, the megalithic city built centuries ago and still in use as a major political center. What differentiated the Russian expedition was that Lyitke was very interested in the native way of life, and gave the most extensive knowledge of the island and its inhabitants. As a result of the new influx of European ships in the region having a lack of nearby or friendly ports to replenish supplies, sailors became increasingly dependent on the Micronesians and their goods. Koshrai and Pohnpei became important within the larger whaling industry of the Pacific, and, in return, this gave valuable knowledge to Micronesians on how to respond to and trade with the foreigners, and allowed them to leverage their power over resources. It is not uncommon to hear stories of islanders destroying ships and killing sailors if the foreigners disrespected the native culture, disrupted established hierarchy, or tried anything to exploit them, resulting in extensive appeasement of local powers by Westerners. This doesn't mean that the men were on their best behavior in Western standards. Often they would be free to drink, engage in sex trade with local women, and many fell in love with the lax lifestyles of the islanders. Hearing of this free living in Micronesia, missionaries were sent to restrain the uncontrolled Westerners and convert the local islanders. Missions were highly unsuccessful, as local chiefs exploited them for personal influence and leverage, while converting to Christianity only in words, so as to not sacrifice their own beliefs. Such extensive contact with these foreigners undoubtedly repeated the same pattern seen in most colonial contact. Unfamiliar diseases would be brought to Micronesia, the most devastating of which was smallpox. These contagions devastated high island populations, sometimes killing 60% of the population, and overall, the death toll is estimated at 30 to 40% of Micronesians. Despite the decline of whaling, Western presence in Micronesia was now permanent, and so was the reality of dealing with their diseases. Fortunately in Yap, the island's interaction with Westerners was much less extensive, but soon, a castaway Irish-American David O'Keefe washed ashore. He would leave soon after, but not without the people making an impression on the man. In searching for personal wealth, and noticing the importance of a giant stone currency quarried in Palau, O'Keefe offered his ship to ferry the stones between Palau and Yap, and provided better tools for the creation of the money. The sudden influx of so many stones created extreme inflation of the currency, and the various German, British, and Spanish traders that visited Yap were angered with O'Keefe with the power he retained over the access to Yapi's trade. Nonetheless, this business endeavor, along with some other Pacific ventures, made O'Keefe a comfortably wealthy and extremely powerful person on Yap. Now, various individuals and nations had trading firms on Yap, which made the islands the center for Western trade within the Carolines. Spanish colonial officials, seeing the various other nations taking advantage of resources in Micronesia without restriction, having to compete for trade within their own claimed lands, and having Germany openly proclaim intentions of annexing Micronesia, sprung Spain into action. At this point in history on the international stage, colonies were less about the wealth they could bring their mother country, and more about the global dominance and prestige. The Spanish Empire itself was greatly in decline, having lost many lucrative colonies, suffering from a long devastating civil war, and their treasury was spread thin and draining quickly. To remain even a minor power at this point, Spain needed to keep every bit of land they could to retain some honor and power projection. When Spain was figuring out how to respond, German expeditions arrived throughout the islands and claimed them for Germany, which brought the nations to the brink of war. But Pope Leo XIII was designated as a mediator, and at the end of discussions, German claims were renounced in return for naval and trading rights. Ceremonies would be held on various islands, and documents signed with islanders to formalize Spanish hold on the territory. Micronesians were not fond of the idea of giving up their land, but with the extensive history of Western interaction on the islands, where local people maintained leverage over foreigners and agreed to many concessions with no intention of following through, why would they believe this would be different? In the end, Micronesians desired to maintain Western trade for power, wealth, and otherwise unobtainable goods. But colonists arrived and began to form a colony on Yap, where Manuel Elisa y Vergara was proclaimed the governor of the Western Carolines. A president of a trading firm on Yap, Creighton Holcomb, was falling behind his competitors, and so hoped to gain favor of the Spanish in trading rights by using his power and the popularity of his wife, Bartola Garrido, to get several chiefs to proclaim their loyalty to Spain. Even once her husband died, Garrido continued the appeasing efforts that proved effective, not only in securing Spanish favor, but also getting islanders to submit to Spain. O'Keefe would also use his local influence to gain favors, as he focused on helping colonists find food and save them from starving. Santa Cristina would be the name of the colony that was soon built, with administrative buildings, barracks, and a fort. But with the governor still recognizing the limits of their power, the native people would be eased into colonial rule. The goal was to slowly civilize the Yapese through gaining the trust of influential chiefs, religion, and attracting the islanders to a European-style economy with labor exchanged for money. Now the Eastern Carolines received their administration, with Isidro Posadillo as its head. The governor was accompanied by 75 troops and a handful of missionaries to Pohnpei. They called the colony they established Santiago de la Ascensión, and respected the locals much less than in the West, and did not care for easing them into civility. Posadillo began humiliating the chiefs with repercussions for not complying with governor's orders, demanding labor of the chiefs to build their colony, and not fulfilling the wages for that labor as promised. Unrest was brewing in the face of such disgrace, but what cemented the oncoming aggression was the attempted dissolution of local chiefly structures and culture. It began with none of the chiefs sending labor for the day. Then, 2 of the chiefs were threatened with public execution. When this didn't work, Spanish troops were sent to capture the chiefs, who were ready to fight. The Spanish shot the first volley, but the return volley and ensuing melee destroyed the colonial troops, and now the tiny colony had to face a mobilized force of Pohnpeians who surrounded Ascensión with trenches overnight. After killing many of the colonizers, driving them to sea, and pillaging the colony, a peace was signed between the two. All the while, the Spanish stayed on their ship, awaiting reinforcements. When they arrived with a new governor and 3 warships, they offered clemency to those who pledged fealty, and thinking it better in the long run to be obedient than disloyal, they agreed. But the pacificity allowed the Spanish to fortify their colony and extend its influence throughout the island, until similar events unfolded again, with tensions rising and forcing the Madolanismo into violence. This chiefdom stood alone, and despite seeing initial success, hundreds of reinforcements were sent to Pohnpei, and the chiefdom's lands were partitioned. Meanwhile on Koshrai, the population had been severely suffering from disease, and their population had dropped by 90% in 60 years. The decline resulted in the collapse of one of the most stable governments in Micronesia. In lieu of governmental structures, American missionaries came to fill the institutional gap, to the disliking of the population who wanted to live traditionally. But the missionaries did introduce the election of a high chief. Awanesa II was one of said high chiefs. But as the missionaries created the governing system, they also held sway over it. So they resisted the reacceptance of traditional lifestyles by this chief. To fight back, Awanesa sailed to Pohnpei and declared his allegiance to Spain if they could help him with his missionary problem, since just getting rid of them outright would gut the government of vital stability. The chief's plea was accepted, and he now returned home with the backing of Spain. So, if Awanesa ever felt undermined, the missionaries would be going against the Spanish authority. In the meantime, the Spanish had a lax policy on Carolinian trade, not influencing it much beyond making sure it was legal, which allowed for 2 German trade firms to obtain dominance in the Carolines. At the same time, Japan, still relatively new to the global system of trade, slowly grew in influence with their own trading firms. With little competition on Chuk because of conflict, Japanese traders were able to gain a small foothold there. Spanish administration laxed even further, as governors lost interest in the development of the colonies and just focused on maintaining a comfortable status quo. They also failed in their goal to civilize islanders, with many still adhering to their own customs. Empowered by the lack of power of their colonizers, Micronesians began to fight back, once again exerting influence over their own lands. The final nail in the coffin for the Spanish in Micronesia came as the Spanish-American War left the nation desperate for funds, and the colony became isolated from their rulers as the Philippines were lost. So, Spain had to sell the Carolines to the Germans. So now, the islands were made part of the German Protectorate of New Guinea, with Pohnpei and Yap remaining centers from which Germany could exert their power in the region. German goals on the islands were to bring cash crops like rubber, coffee, or cocoa, and hopefully establish some profitable plantations. Garrisons left by Germany were hilariously small, but because the Germans were basically starting from scratch on the islands, they had the opportunity to gain the trust of Micronesians. One way they hoped to maintain power and expand control to Chuk was a massive disarmament program and the curbing of firearms sales. Miraculously, both the Trukees and Pohnpeians complied, and these went from some of the most violent places in Micronesia to peaceful and cooperative colonies. Yap saw great success as well, with the population able to be mobilized to greatly expand public works, but otherwise, the Yappies were left to their own devices. However, the German public saw increasing dissatisfaction over the newly acquired colonies, as they had shown very little growth, while putting a strain on the German economy. Thus, the new German colonial policy was as such. Colonization is the utilization of the earth, of the flora and fauna, and above all, the human beings to the advantage of the colonizing nation, and the latter is therefore obligated to give in return its higher culture, its moral concepts, and its better methods. So, a similar system that was used on Yap was applied to Pohnpei, meaning chiefs would be expected to fulfill a labor tax, where they would send men to work for the Germans for a time to develop the island. This was extremely unpopular here, so when some laborers were flogged for insubordination, this kind of disrespect flung the Germans into a war with Soke. The garrison of 50 men was put to siege at the colonial center, and they were forced to flee, only to return later with several warships full of men, who fought a brutal battle on the fortified Soke positions. Eventually, they dispersed the forces, successful in the battle, but showing that the colonies in Micronesia would remain economic burdens. The First World War breaks out, and Japan, seeing this as an opportunity to expand into the Pacific, declares war on Germany. Without much trouble, the Japanese occupied Yap very early in the war. They would continue on, landing on various German islands in quick succession. Mostly, German forces would flee and surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. Before the war even ended, military governments were established, with forces that invaded the islands. To help cement their claims over these islands, the Japanese built public works, such as the first ever public schools and hospitals, and they would focus on expanding the economy by subsidizing trade between Japan and Micronesia. Eventually, the lands were officially ceded to Japan in the Versailles Treaty. Despite the discomfort of the British and Americans who had claims over Micronesia, the League of Nations recognized the territorial transfer. Two parallel systems of chiefs and a colonial government was unacceptable, so the Japanese worked on a government type that both benefited them and integrated the indigenous political structure. This would be done through Japanese appointed chiefs, but to reach this aim, they had to undermine existing structures and repress local institutions, so the Japanese were generally disliked by islanders. As always, the islanders chose to passively resist, to the frustration of the Japanese. who, in turn, invested less and less energy into Micronesia. Once it was discovered how abundant tuna was in Micronesia, many Japanese fishers flocked there and integrated into local communities. The tuna industry became a prominent part of the economy, but the demand for products that these fishers created meant that the influx of Japanese settlers never stopped, with tens of thousands making their homes there, and the Micronesians became a minority in their own islands. These people needed to eat, and islanders weren't in favor of destroying their forests for farmland. So, Japan did everything they could to take as much land as possible from them. The islands were developed even more. Various industries were expanded, and finally, Micronesia could say that it was industrialized. And here is where Colonia, formerly Asuncion, rises to prominence to become a massive population center. Nationalism had gripped Japan, and an expansionist war into China sprung up. Having planned this for a while, immediately the Japanese military came to Micronesia and secretly began building an airbase. Initially though, this was the only avenue that the islands felt the war. Those that lived on the islands were too busy enjoying the economic prosperity from the recent boom. But as the war continued and Germany began fighting in Europe, Japanese expansionism saw some more opportunities. Thus, more air bases were built, and the islands were prepared to house soldiers. To complete the construction in a reasonable time, conscript laborers were sent to the islands to work alongside islanders, who were also forced into the work. Many died in the projects as the Japanese forced them to work unfeasible hours. Soon, the projects were finished, and thousands of military men poured on the islands. Chuuk even became the headquarters of the Japanese Fourth Fleet, but this strained the food supply and accommodations. Chuuk became increasingly important as the war went on, being a staging ground for further offensives, while also being a connection between Japan and its territories south and east. At one point, the island even housed the famous Yamato, but the Second World War shifted very quickly, forcing Japan on the defensive and making Micronesia the outer perimeter in the defense of Japan proper, with 50,000 troops now prepared throughout Micronesia. Many islanders were forced from their homes and told to live in the wilderness or exiled for the duration of the military presence on Micronesia, so that Japan could accommodate these soldiers. Devastating bombing runs became the norm, especially as the Carolines became surrounded, with both Palau and the Marshall Islands under US control. But American strategy at this point in the war was bypassing islands unnecessary for the ultimate goal of victory. So, as the war dragged on, the only American military presence was through their bombs, and a few islands taken to be launching points towards Okinawa. Starvation was common in Micronesia at this time, as the siege of the islands continued until the end of the war, where the Japanese stationed in Micronesia were told by high command to surrender to Americans. To the relief of Micronesians, Americans soon landed and distributed much-needed relief supplies, and the new occupiers of Micronesia were welcomed gladly, as it marked an end to their suffering. The lands were technically not ceded to America. Instead, they were considered part of a trusteeship under the direction of the United States, which means that the US was tasked with guiding Micronesia to independence into a 20th century world. Ultimately, the goal of America was to establish a self-sufficient economy, but lacked the funds to do so. Instead, rebuilding of the island's industry began with joint stock companies, which was vital to local trade and the economy. In the meantime, while the Americans discussed how they would establish a government that wouldn't anger the islanders, Micronesians began to rediscover their cultural heritage due to the policy of non-interventionism by the occupiers. Municipal governments were established first, and slowly this would be extended upwards, accustoming natives to civilian democracy and avoiding the retaliation of chiefs. Chuuk became the meeting place for where the leaders of the various districts of the Trust Territory would meet, creating a sense of unity between the different parts. Otherwise, not much else was done in the region, and this lack of intervention in the lands became seen as negligence, with government buildings and infrastructure in an embarrassing state of disrepair or inadequacy. So under pressure from the international community and American citizens, the government started investing in education and building schools. And finally, the islands would soon have a governing body across the entire trust. Locals rejoiced as the Congress of Micronesia was formed, as initiative was now in their hands. Around the same time, low-interest loans were offered to entrepreneurs. Loans proved immeasurably helpful as the consumer market exploded, and indigenous populations concentrated in cities that were the centers of these goods. Ideas of self-governance spread through the territory, since the Americans rejected proposals of further independence within the trusteeship. And with the growing power of China, the Micronesians had the perfect leverage. However, this leverage also meant that the US was less willing to allow such action, and it was evident in the ensuing negotiations. But eventually, the American position softened and agreed to let go. In their agreement, the islands would need to make a constitution and allow the Americans to maintain a military presence. But disagreements and negotiation were found within the trust as well. Certain islands made demands that suited their needs primarily, and many had varying views of the status of chiefs within the new nation. Divisions were exacerbated as the districts came together to create the constitution, where the hopes of a united Micronesia fell apart, as the delegations of the Marshalls, Palau, and the Marianas decided to pursue an independent agreement with the United States instead. The districts of Yap, Chuk, and Pohnpei, with similar goals, were the last to stay united, and after adding a district of Koshrai, the constitution was approved, and the federated states of Micronesia declared independence. Firstly, they had to determine their relationship with the United States, who wanted to maintain a military presence on the islands. But negotiations were agreed that the United States would pay Micronesia to keep military bases on the islands, and be responsible for their defense. Some consider this point the moment Micronesia became independent, as it set the conditions to toss aside restrictions of the trusteeship it was under. Once the last vestiges of colonialism were finally gone, with the trusteeship abolished, Micronesia became a member state of the UN. However, hardship was not over, as global warming has presented Micronesia with significant problems with not only rising sea levels threatening population centers, but increased severity in natural disasters. Tourism, which had been a growing part of the economy, dropped off, in response to the natural forces destroying the islands. So while trying to balance these issues, Micronesia generally focused on maintaining a stable economy with what little industry it has, by supporting the private sector. Unfortunately, as the central government has little exertion of power, most islands remain relatively independent and separate, to the extent that Chuk debated independence. This sentiment has yet to be acted upon, but there remains strong support on the island, and several referendums were planned. The strategic position of Micronesia has increased in importance, as China has begun challenging American interests in the region. When China wanted to expand their influence into the Pacific, Chinese foreign investment started flowing into Micronesia, and economic relations were strengthened. Influence grew to a point that on Micronesian President David W. Panuelo's visit to China, he stated that he didn't recognize Taiwan, completely opposing American foreign policy, occurring at a vital time, as Micronesia's military agreement with the United States was set to expire, and hopefully for the Chinese, the Micronesians wouldn't renew it. However, Panuelo had a change of heart in his foreign policy around his recognition of Taiwan, in that Taiwan would add to American funding to Micronesia if they remained its allies. The president publicly stated that China had been offering bribes for Micronesia to shift its alliance. This declaration, in a sense, publicly declaring Micronesia's maintained relations with the USA, and the undermining of Chinese interests. And that was the state of the nation of Micronesia. Please like and subscribe if you liked the video, and if you have any suggestions or comments, leave them in the comment section below, or email me with my email in the description. I also started a Patreon if anyone is interested in supporting a small creator like myself.